So, welcome everyone. First of all, thank you very much for making it on a Friday afternoon. I know you students, for you weekday doesn't matter, we could do it on Sunday afternoon, you would show up, would you? Hey, really? Okay, that's cool. Well, thank you very much anyway, because that's the only time where this room is actually free. So other than that, I would have preferred any other time as well. Cool, so still some people missing, so good, well, everything will be streamed. If you feel, you feel inclined to get closer to the music, if you like, it's up to you, of course. So yesterday, you had a talk, or no, wrong, Mariusz had a talk about Unity, right, I believe? You guys were there?
Yeah.
Good, got some insight of how it works, a bit better understanding about the tool? Ish, okay. Well, I think he will continue this exercise next session, I believe next Thursday, because the objective is really to get you guys really, an overview of the platform, even though you will not or may not use it professionally, or you may, depending what you want to do. At least to get some, insight, some experience of how you could go about designing a game. Right? Even if you're designing, you at least know how the developing perspective looks as well, right? So bringing those two together. So what I'm talking about is, I'll put it this way. The reason why we talk about something else, we actually like to do stuff, but we also need to provide some material because apparently we need to write an exam. So, I need to give you a bit of theory so we can actually test you on something. So otherwise it would be fairly boring, wouldn't it? Yes. Well, jokes aside, we of course make it as interactive as possible, I guess. So, but one of the things that is important in games, and I think talked about this in the very first session as well, in the intro to games, balance, right? So, chance and balance. Intuitively, what is chance and balance? Yeah, please.
It's hard to remember I understand what it is, but something balance could be like mean that something that isn't like too hard or too easy, that is like has a good balance in the difficulty.
That's right, right. How would you call it in norsk? Balancering, or what would be the term? Balance, okay. So balance, yeah, that's right. So making something not hard, in which context do you need this? When you think about hard and easy, what did you think about?
It could be anything, but like games also, and just in life general, that it shouldn't be too easy or hard, as your study shouldn't be easy or too hard. It could be like almost anything, but this is just ideal way to work with something.
Yeah.
That kind of like this, like
yeah.
too much this or too.
Yeah. I understand. So your understanding is that life is a game, and you just need to balance that as well, right? To some extent. Actually, you're not wrong, in fact, right? So when we make exams, for example, we kind of balance as well, right? So we could, of course, try to fail you all by asking you questions you have no answers for, right? So, but that would not be fun on the one hand, that would not be good for us, and certainly not in your own interest. So, we want to balance it as well, that's right. But I think there are some things in real life that you can't really control and balance, so sometimes it's out of our control. I'm not sure if you had that experience, but yeah, so it can happen. But anyway, it's a good point, that's right. So it's really about dealing with the challenge level, right? So to accommodate the individual's capabilities and needs and so on. And here, of course, we do it more specifically in the context of games, right? Because games is really about designing an artificial world, You're kind of a god figure, if you like, right? So you make the world, the environment, and you also make the rules of the game, right? So in real life, you may not have influence on this, but in games you do. In fact, you're the person that has to deal with this. And it doesn't matter whether you're a developer at this stage or designer of a game, because that's not necessarily a technical task per se. Of course, it's encoded in software that you use when you devise games and in Unity and so on. But it's fundamentally a paper decision you're actually making, right? So you're deciding, okay, what is hard, what is easy, how hard should it be, what should, how complicated should the game be? And you do that before you actually implement the game, well, afterwards as well. It's an iterative process anyway. So, yeah, so that's basically the idea. So, and fundamental aspects or preliminary aspects or prerequisite for actually calculating balance, you need to have some sort of notion of chance, right? And that's usually probability, I guess, right? So throwing a dice, probability 0.5. And if you're going for probability of a particular number on a dice, then you go from 1/6, you know, and then it goes downwards from there if you have dependency between those. So that's fundamentally the idea. While this will not be a math lecture, actually it will not be a math lecture at all, roughly. So it's just important that you understand the idea of probability, of course, and that while we have ways of perhaps accurately specifying probability and chance in games, it's sometimes not helpful, right? So I don't know if we talked about this in the earlier session as well. If you have games that are very realistic and they actually implement, you know, the physical laws in very, very, very rigidly, they're usually not much fun, actually, right? So it's about playing with those probabilities in this artificial world, in this game, to make your game fun. Because fundamentally, if you're developing games, you're looking for entertainment, right? So entertainment in a simple sense, just to entertain somebody, but also in an engaging sense. For example, you want to write a game that teaches you something. It still needs to be entertaining to some extent, right? So else it's boring stuff. So yeah, there's some interesting observations even in the realm of mathematics. For example, if you have a uniform random distribution of variables, well, if you add them up, actually, they turn out not to be so much random anymore, but actually become a normal distribution as well, right? So it always boils down that that you, by modification of the underlying formalisms, you can quickly shift or change probabilities in a direction of your choice, right? So, and even if you just purely assume that we combine random variables, you will find that the outcoming distribution is not so random after all, but rather has a bell curve kind of characteristic. Not something we need to go into massively. But one of the things that's probably more important than the actual probability is what the user, the gamer in particular, expects, right? If you make choices in real life or in games, so I follow your idea on treating real life as a game, you have expectations of what you do, right? So, for example, when you go to university, you decide, okay, what are the expectations and on what grounds do you make the decision? For example, you have NTNU, you have Oslo, I think there's a university as well there, right? 3, right? So anyway, and you know, some other places in Norway, Tromsø and so on, you need to make the call, okay, which one do I go to, right? So you need to calculate this value. And that's probably more important than the actual probability that underlies it, you know, in a technical sense. And if you're in a very crude way, that's a tough one though, if you're in a very crude way, think about how do you calculate your expectations, right? So in whatever way, how could you go about it? It's a tough one, I don't know. I've not tried that interactively, see if we arrive anywhere. If not, I'll quickly leave the room and start screaming. Anyway, please, yeah?
If you're going to like kind of expectation, for example, what you expect of universities,
yeah,
then you can have like a list of like
yeah,
the different possibilities of the different universities in Norway.
Yeah.
And you have like a way to calculate it more.
Exactly. That's what you're doing, right? So you're creating a list of features, and what are you doing then if you want to calculate them? Because we need to calculate, you know, we're dealing with computers and probabilities and, you know, yes, maths, so we can't change it. So how do you get to numbers from this approach? We'll get there.
You get to something positive and something negative, and then you have some like plus points for the positive and some bad things, -1 for the negative.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you have basically a list of preferences, and you attach some values to it, right? So, you know, +2, +1, 0, -1, -2, right? So your priority list kind of thing, and then you can, you know, gauge and organize what's most important for you, and, you know, calculate what makes most sense, and then finally decide, yeah, I went to this university because they have experience design as a course. Really? Anyway, so probably not. But the point is, that's roughly the idea, right? You're calculating probabilities. On the one hand, your actual gain you get from going to a university. But the other thing you can also look at, what's your probability of getting in, right? So there may be also risk committing to the wrong university, and you don't have a chance of getting in, even though it's the highest choice, and you know need to find an alternative then, right? So. I mean, that's usually, it's probably not so much an issue here, but in the US it's very much an issue that people commit to go to a particular university, for example. Fundamentally, I'm not sure if you agree with this formula, but it's usually the loss or reward attached with something, right? So of either being admitted or not admitted university, for example, or winning in the game or defeating your next enemy, and of course the probability of success, right? So what is the gain that you get out of it? But what's the probability of actually making it in the first place? Would you waste time applying for a very attractive job in the gaming industry, if you like, if you know that your chance of getting in is 1%? Right? So it's a very high reward at the end if you actually get in, for you personally, I guess. But it's a lot of time investment as well, right? You need to write application and motivation letter and so on. And the probability is really 1%. You're kidding me? I mean, come on. Then you better play Lotto, because in Lotto at least you don't need to spend any effort in buying a ticket, right? So those are the calculations. So it's not just what is the gain and the loss, but also the probability or the effort, the money, the expense associated with this. And expense is not always monetarily. It can just be, it can be time. Time is money anyway, but or cognitive involvement and so on, right? So that's quite relevant. So that's the basic formula for calculating it. Of course, it doesn't solve everything for all kind of games, but it's one way of thinking about it. And so that's probably more important than chance per se. But so the decision-making mechanism that humans underlie. And the other thing is that humans are actually not too good with probabilities, right? So we can calculate them somewhat, but if we apply them intuitively, we're not particularly good. Or even with rationality in the widest sense, there's quite a bit of evidence in that in social psychology. For example, I'll give you an example of irrational choices. You would imagine, so every Sunday, I believe, fuel prices are down in Norway, right? So they go down, and you can refuel a car cheaply. Yes, no, perhaps? Am I the only one making that observation?
On Sunday there's like cheaper prices on
fuel.
That depends on the gas station.
Yeah, bensinstation, okay.
Some like Mondays, some like Tuesdays.
Okay, let's assume we have a fixed day. You see, I'm constructing my problem a bit. So that's a game already. Let's assume we have a fixed day where the price is dipping a bit, right? So, and the differences between the fuel stations will only be 1 to 2 cents, right? Euro, right? As really, really marginal, actually not much. Nevertheless, I could imagine people driving around through the city, figuring out what's the lowest price, and only then refuel their car, and probably have spent more on their fuel driving around than actually they have saved when actually refilling the car, right? So that's an observation that has been done in the 70s sometime. It's irrational behavior of human beings. So it doesn't really make sense. If you calculate rationally, it doesn't make sense, because you go, if the prices are down, go to the next cheapest one, fill up, go home, that's it. Minimize your driving, right? As opposed to looking for the cheapest fuel station, because the relative price drop is higher, or the absolute price drop compared to the rest of the week is higher than the relative price drop compared to the neighboring, gas station or whatever, right? So those kind of things. So we humans are kind of weird, right? We always think we are rational and do that kind of stuff. We don't, right? So that's the message here, and it also applies for players, of course, right? You can teach intuitions about probability. But for example, if you throw a dice, right, and you get 5 times a 1, right? Aren't you starting to get suspicious as well if the dice is somewhat, off, right? From a probabilistic point of view, all good, no big deal, right? So it's the law of large numbers. We just need to do it 300,000 times, and probably it will even out again, so we'll be fine. But for us as players, which want to work on instances, right? So we need to one dice throw decide something in our next move in the game. We want to be sure that it's actually fair, for example, right? So and that's one of those things that's there. In case you're looking at the book, I know some of you do this Lens's book, The Art of Game Design. It's under Lens 35. It's discussed the expected value with nice examples as well. Yeah, part of the reason why understanding of probability is so bad is the reason why gambling is so popular, right? So that's why Lotto works, right? I mean, realistically, Lotto should not work. No one should play. It's irrational to engage in Lotto playing, right? Because the probability of getting anything out of it is incredibly low. But still, it works, right? So people go for it. Quite crazy. So so after having found out we're crazy, so how do we go from there? So yeah, we need to see. Yes, so humans are also in terms of estimating things, we rather work on intuition than actually doing the calculation. And the point is, even if you start doing the calculations, you're usually punished. If you go to a casino and start counting cards, it will take like 15 minutes, and you'll be happily greeted and invited to leave the casino afterwards. So the whole industry builds on the idea that you don't deal with the probabilities and make the maths basically. And in fact, humans are not particularly good at understanding independent chance. So again, the dice throw is one of those examples. The fact that you have thrown a dice and got a 1 out of it is totally independent from your next dice throw, right? Where you get a 1 again, right? So, but you see, okay, there's a pattern emerging. Scary, right? So then the conspiracy theorist in you will be slowly activated, and then some superstitions come into play, and we kind of think, oh, right, there's something iffy there going on, right? So pigeons are much better at this. Mostly because they don't recognize those patterns at all, right? So they are just doing the same task again naively, and don't see the, I guess, bigger picture to some extent. So in this case, they have an edge on us. So bear that in mind. Yeah, if you have a random task to solve, bring a pigeon. It's always handy to have. So the difference is really what is random, what feels random, right? So the dice throw is a good example. And in games, if you're constantly losing against your enemy, doesn't feel random either, right? Because you simply don't have the sufficiently large number of interactions with an enemy to give you the feeling that something is random. But if you do it truly random, then it may actually not feel quite random, but actually kind of biased because it's the short time frame you're observing it. So in this case, you would, for example, how could you deal with this in a game? Assuming you have a probabilistic interaction with enemy, role play kind of thing, right? How can you ensure that there's some balance there? Just as a question out there. Intuitive, please.
Give player chances to choose difficulties, maybe?
Of course, yeah, that's right. So, okay, now let's follow your idea. And we introduce difficulties, right? Let's say difficulty easy. So what are you doing then in your game? Easy means I win more often, right? So
basically making the AI dumber.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually surprisingly hard, right? Making AI hard is actually nowadays easier than making AI stupid. So, yep, that's right. So making AI stupid, so adjusting probabilities is one of them as well, right? But even if you don't adjust the probabilities per se, what could you do to a random number generator to make it feel random? Oh, that's random. Anyway, please.
The computer chooses numbers that the user won't expect.
Can you? So numbers that the user won't expect. But if I throw a dice, I don't. What do I expect? What do you think I would expect? It's mostly for clarification.
I don't really know. If you get like 2 6s in a row and then think, oh man, I'm maybe going to get like a third 6 in a row, that you don't get it, and you feel, it's random. It's not like
yeah. I think your comments are going in the right direction. You kind of twist the random number generator to work on the short term, right? So you have a bit of randomness in there, 2 6s in a row, and you compensate it with a 1, and two 3s afterwards, and things like that. So you make it feel random, but actually you have a very controlled randomness. That would be your way around it, right? So in the easiest case, if you have a 50% chance, you always have a binary flip, right? 1 0 1 0 1 0 gives me a feeling of randomness. It's not random, of course, but you may get away with this in a game, right? Maybe slightly safer. Right? And then attached to lower probabilities, then you can make things easier or harder. So it's really about, again, tricking us humans into thinking that something is really, really random in a way. And of course, we have independent randomness, right? So that's one of the aspects, but we also have kind of dependent randomness, of course, right? If you have this exercise with the, did you see that in maths somewhere in school or something like this? So basically you have a bucket, right? Balls in there, you don't see how many balls are in there. You may know that there's a 50-50 chance of picking a, in this case, black or white ball. But without replacement, of course, the probabilities will change over time, right? So humans can be equally bad at identifying dependencies between events, right? In this case, The fact that 3 white balls have been taken out of this bag, of course, shifts the probability towards getting a black one dramatically, right? So, so that's something we are kind of more tuned to because we like superstitions and assume dynamics. We assume intentionality in those kind of things, but it can be equally hard for us to deal with this and actually keep track of it, because a random dice throw is easier to grasp because it's independent, right? So basically it's like the same thing with replacement. It would be the same thing as if you have get a white ball out of it and replace it with white ball without the user seeing, and then have a new draw. That would be a probability with replacement, but without replacement there is a skew and change. And sometimes, especially if you're dealing with resources in games, right? Food or tokens, black and white, I don't know, or whatever colors and so on. And users need to pick them or capture them and so on. Probabilities of a change a game can suddenly drift dramatically, right? So suddenly, okay, if the best tokens have been taken by one particular player group, the probability of getting worse ones is getting increasingly large for the inferior player. So suddenly the lead and the second player kind of manifest it in their ways, and it just gets worse when the game goes on, right? If it's not really controlled randomness, if you like, right? So and this is sometimes overseen as well. Pointless games are really complex because you have a lot of those choices, or not necessarily choices, either they are made by the machine or by the user, which kind of accumulate, and suddenly you get a drift of the system into one or another direction. And true randomness will be quite hard, in fact. So that's the kind of message here. Okay, let's think about games. Where do we need balance? What are the aspects of games, particular? And I mean any sort of game. Can it be a cardboard game? Can it be a computer game? Can it be the live game, if you like? I don't know. So what are aspects where balance is of relevance? If you think about game design, for example.
Reward systems?
Yep. What specifically? That's right, of course.
Say, like gears in an RPG.
Right. Okay.
Helmet or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you? Yep. Cool. That's kind of a reward thing. So you need to balance it up, right? So, for example, if you have one particular tribe with particular gear, and you have a different tribe with gear that is specific to them, it kind of needs to overall balance up. Otherwise, it will be kind of a really shitty game, I guess. So, yeah. Other cases?
Basically the same, but you have a game where you do different parties, and both the rules that apply to different parties have to, balance.
Yeah.
So the powers they have are different than theirs, so they still need to be able to get a chance on each other.
Yeah.
Or meet each other.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a good point. That's a good aspect. That's right. Yeah. So that reminds me of some other aspect, which is like a notion of adaptiveness. If you think about balance, right? So, for example, the one player leads in the game, right? So then you lose the entertainment factor, right? So because the other, I'm probably going to lose, and the winner gets demotivated as well because there's not much happening there, right? So it may be sometimes good to have a bit of a boost of luck on the part of the inferior player to prolong the game, right? So actually both parties stay involved, but actually you use balance, but not in a random sense, but in a systematic sense to fix the game, right? In your interest, of course, right? To bend the rules to accommodate. So that's a very good point that you're making, and it relates to this dynamic notion of it. So point is, if you apply balance, it doesn't. It can apply to fairness, a concept like this, but it also can apply to an engagement value in a wide sense, right? So not just strictly being fair and being equal and so on. That's not realistic in games, of course. So what other aspect could be relevant? Think about players in themselves. Yep.
Someone mentioned earlier, the difficulties.
Yeah.
You have to be able to balance. Okay, so many people are struggling with this. How will we probably make it easier, but not too easy, and not too hard on the middle, but not too easy on the middle, and not too hard, but definitely not as easy as the rest.
Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. The sweet spot there, right? So a kind of trade-off of challenge and feasibility, right? So else gets frustrated if you can't do it, right? So and if it's too easy, then yeah, again, people drift off. That's usually the more annoying bit. Frustration, both is bad because it usually means people will abandon your interaction, the game, And again, maybe board game or maybe any sort of other game. So it doesn't really matter. So very good, yes, exactly. Needs to match and balance player skills, right? And I mean, one of the things is also, think about, that's more like hypothetical though. You have two players against playing each other, right? At the same time, multiplayer. And one is highly skilled, one is low skilled, right? So even then you could apply some balancing there in real time, right? For example, think about first person shooter and for example, the probability of hitting with lower levels accuracy is way higher for the inferior player, right? So and lower for the better player, right? So things like this. So you still have a nice, if you can call it this way, interaction between those players, despite the fact that they are vastly different, right? So yeah, so you want to play against your grandpa or something like this, so that would be then suddenly a fair game again. Yeah, cool. What other things? Rewards, freedom, complexity. So there's some points here, a lot of them, and so I think we touched on many of them. So fairness, of course, in principle should be there. So everyone should have equal chance per se, let alone the skills. Balance also means having a roughly equivalent amount of choices, right? So that individuals actually have the chance to, you know, have the same entertainment value, right? If you have 6 choices, well, probably should get 6 choices as well as a different player, right? Independent of the concrete nature of the choices, but just from an engagement point of view, it's quite handy, quite valuable. So drilling down in some of those aspects, not all of them. Of course, fairness is principle idea that anyone that enters the game should have a roughly same chance to win. Right? How realistic that is a question, and that's usually the only time you can really control this is the start. Afterwards, it's kind of drifting off, and then it becomes unfair to change the game technically, right? So fairness is a tricky one and can actually only be applied at the beginning, right? So so here there's some comments about the different skill levels, how to ensure fairness. Yeah, another point is, for example, if you have a strategy game, you can give the better player or the hard player worse starting positions, less resources, for example, right? So it makes their gameplay a lot harder if you think about, yeah, some complex, some economic simulation or things like this. So yeah. One of the main balances, however, for recreating fairness is to play multiple rounds. And that's oftentimes not done, right? So in some cases you do it, for example, chess, often the expectation that you have multiple rounds. But if you play a multiplayer game, that may not necessarily be the case, right? Because you don't have the time, or it's not the norm to do that, right? You just play and that's it, right? So that could also be a way of recreating that chance. So one of the things to do that is, of course, having symmetric games. So classically, that would be board games that have a symmetric setup. Identical strengths and characteristics, chess being a classic in this one, but even this one is a tough one, right? So there's still asymmetry, because in the end, one of the biases in chess, of course, is the white one starts, right? So there you go. At this stage, the choice is already limited on the other party's side, right? So because there's the bias, okay, if you use, whatever pawn you actually move will influence your next decision. So the initial decisional freedom of the white player is greater than the one of the other side, right? So things like this. But again, multiple sessions to balance that up would be the only way out of it. But the key understanding here is that even games that seemingly seem fair are oftentimes not, right? So that's quite insightful. And we talk about this to some extent here, different forces, especially in those simulation games like StarCraft style and things like this, Civilization. How do you deal with individuals that have different capabilities? Because else it's super boring, right? So you don't have the same kind of, I don't know, role or typus or culture if you want to play Civilization, if you like. Play against each other, right? Because you need to mix it up, right? So you have the different backgrounds, different characteristics, and so on. But still, you need to balance it somehow, so that the rules add up in the end, and that the items, as you would say, also make sense, right, across the different cultures. So, question to you: Nefertafel, or Nefertafel. I don't even know if I pronounced it correctly. Does anyone know what that is? Oh, okay. So this is actually a Nordic game, apparently, and this is the one displayed here. So it's various variants in all the Scandinavian countries, including UK as well, at some stages. And the point is, no one knows the rules really, so don't ask me. Well, it has been so kind of yeah, chess has overtaken, you know, so kind of, I think they stopped playing in the 17th century or something like this, and then chess came and the story was over. But the point is, this is an asymmetric game, interestingly, right? So the setup, so you have this, you know, aggressor on 4 sides and then defending party in the inner center. So it's an interesting game that is asymmetric by design, which is kind of not common, right? So so that was is a quite insightful example, meaning those games actually exist, right? And if you want to build those games, there's only one way or 2 ways of figuring it out. Analytically, you do the maths, right? So you can calculate the probabilities of, you know, either player winning, but more realistically nowadays playing, right? Because mathematically you may come up with solutions that no one would ever play. So in this case, it would still be unfair, because if those rare solutions were never to be played, only the subset of the, you know, more common solution would be played. There may be bias between those different strategies. So trial and error, right? There's no discussions about it. It's always about playtesting. It's entire. If you take one thing away from this lecture, I hope you do, it's about playtesting. It's all about playtesting, right? So you do something, think about something, and, you know, theorize something. You still need to test it. But if you're interested, you probably should look that up. Tafel games, right? Or table Tafel games. You guys know better anyway. So there's different variants of it. Quite interesting. Okay, cool. So we have multiple sessions, of course, quite straightforward. The effect is meta balancing. You're not balancing in the game, you're balancing between games, right? So that's the key idea there. And then, yeah, you have a chance. In fact, you can, of course, also then introduce systematic biases in the game, because if you know that you need to play multiple rounds, you can give one player an edge in one round and the other player an edge in another round. That may be also be a bit more, you know, challenging in a way. So, but classically, it's used in, you know, ball games, for example, or chess or things like this. Very classical idea. Example for balancing abilities, just to run through it. I mean, you mentioned it before with the university example already. I think that's quite straightforward. If you, for example, have different weaponry, right? So you have a different distribution of, you know, jeeps, APCs, armored personnel carriers, I guess, and tanks. They have different characteristics, right? But how do you actually calculate which distribution of those, you know, is fair to be grouped in particular conflicting armies or something like this, right? So, and that's precisely how you do it. You basically attach some values. You need to quantify it ultimately. There's no way around it otherwise. And, you know, add it up. So, and then you can see if that's somewhat balancing, right? So it, of course, needs to correspond to other characteristics. So even if you have this kind of mechanism, you feel like, okay, I can figure out how much the relative value of a jeep is compared to a tank. What is the aspect that's not considered in this calculation? If you look at the categories, armor, weapon, speed. Be creative.
What do you mean as what expectation?
Yep. So right now we're only looking at the vehicles, right? So Jeep, APC, and tank, right? So we're attaching some values to it, to different challenge levels and so on. Is that alone enough? So does that ensure a balanced game?
Like a tech tree or something, you could have put
Again, I didn't get
a
it.
tech tree, like sort of like you need more advanced buildings to build a tank than
Okay. Yep. Okay, so that's right. Environmental conditions. So how long does it take until I actually get there, right? So I want to have this beast of a tank there, but, you know, if you spend half my playtime to actually build the facilities to build it, not cool. Yeah, that's a good one. What else?
How easy they are to use.
Yeah, exactly. Usability could be a factor, right? That's right. So it's kind of been implied in the speed thing, I guess. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's missing there. Yep. Something else? Well, for example, I mean, this is of course in the setting of a conflict-style game, right? So war game kind of setting you would imagine. But you need to, of course, match it against the weapons, right? You can have as much armor as you want if you have, you know, 2 overpowering weapons that can, for example, kill a tank with, you know, 2 strikes if you like. But they can kill, for example, APC with 1 strike. That implies they can also kill a Jeep with 1 strike. So meaning the balance between Jeep and the APC is lost suddenly, right? Relative to that stronger weapon. So what I'm saying is you need to look at the whole picture. So it's not only the devices, but also what's related to it. What does speed mean? Is it relevant? Can you outrun a weapon perhaps, right? Then suddenly speed will actually be superior, right? So if you're faster than the rocket chasing you, which is ridiculous, of course, suddenly the Jeep would be the superior weapon, right? So of course, so it needs to be balanced on in the big picture, small picture, but also in the context of the entire game. So just by looking at this, you cannot say much about whether it's actually balanced, right? But of course, it's driving in the right direction and something. So you need to adjust and play until you get the balance somewhat right. Playtest, right? So you need to really put it in there and actually playtest the heck out of it, I guess. That's the main choice. But fundamentally, you can make such consideration here in terms of point distribution, because it makes it kind of easier to see, okay, what's the maximum of possible points that can be allocated with either party, and then automatically calculate how many vehicles I could get of what either type, and then randomly distribute, well, pseudo-randomly distributed for across the different parties. So having some numbers attached to it is helpful, for example, for initializing a game. Yeah. So if you want to decide a random number of, kind of systematic random number of vehicles of different types. Yeah. Yeah, that was roughly it. So basically, it's about the bigger picture and getting the calculations right. But of course, you can also have reasonably balanced games. So you guys explored that to some extent. Does anyone recall? Most of you will. So we probably, yeah, don't necessarily need to go into that. Rock, scissors, paper, yes. By the way, this game is, where's it from, that game? Any guesses?
Everywhere.
That's usually a cool answer. That's usually kind of gets the points. Yeah, please. Yeah, the upper one, not the second one.
Okay.
Well, the second one, where's the second one from?
Big Bang Theory.
That's right. So on the first one, that's the harder one.
From the Greeks, I don't know.
Yeah, could be. So yeah. So now apparently that's it was actually played in China. So in the 1500s already, in a variation, of course. They didn't call it rock paper scissors. Surprise, surprise. But the same kind of idea on the balancing notion, and it spread from there then to Europe, and then fundamentally to US, and then were popularized there. So, but again, you're right, everywhere, right? So that's in fact the essence, because it's fundamentally a perfectly balancing game, whatever that means. And people, only games that are kind of balanced actually succeed, right? If your game doesn't balance, most likely you will not survive long as a publisher. That publisher survived long. In fact, no one knows the publisher anymore, right? So that's a very good outcome, I guess. So yeah, it's cool. That's the full visualization of it's.
That's pretty true.
Sorry.
Like the unbalanced game doesn't survive. Like.
Well, the idea is.
Tic-tac-toe, like that's shouldn't that not balance, is it?
Which one? Sorry.
Tic-tac-toe.
Ah, tic-tac-toe. Right. Yeah. True. Yeah. Okay. Defeated. I agree. So there are those random exceptions. Yeah, you can try out. That's right. So again, but you can play multiple rounds though. You could play multiple rounds, right?
Yeah, true.
So then you can do meta balancing on those. You do, in fact, right? Tic-tac-toe is always played in multiple rounds, right? So by that intuition, so you kind of get the meta balance right. But I'm more thinking about if a game is inherently biased towards one side, player type, characteristics and so on, then it's really going sideways quite quickly. Does anyone have an example for a game they possibly played and that's really like bad, that just gave up because it's so shittily balanced, irrespective of all the rest?
Blood Bowl. It's an fantasy American football game.
Okay. Can you elaborate? What's the issue with it?
It's basically impossible to play even on easy because the computer always high rolls for itself. Most of the game is based on dice. When your character passes by an opponent character,
Yeah.
It rolls for if the opponent character can intercept your character, and the computer consistently have higher chance of rolling for himself clearing such obstacles, and you just
lose all the time, basically.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's shitty, right? So yeah, so okay. Any other? There was some other injections. I was looking for those kind of examples. No. But more commonly, you probably have something like scenario that you have multiple roll options, right? So, and you find out that 2 of them actually work quite well. They're balanced, and there's heaps of them that are shitty not balanced. They're just, like if you think about, I don't know, what is, I don't know, ideas?
I'm just going to comment on Blood Bowl.
Okay, please.
Because it's true that the RNG is really biased towards the computer.
Yeah.
Which I think is really so fun, because when you're 2 players, it's still biased to the computer, so both do really shitty.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, it depends how you apply balance here, but okay, right,
So
right. So what's the way out? Just playing without the computer?
just playing with friends and then just laugh at each other, I guess.
Okay, okay. So you need to take it. Yeah. Okay. So evidently you guys still play it.
I haven't played it too much because it's a football game and I'm not, I don't know American football game and I'm not so sport game.
Right, right, right. Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Other comments? No. No pain then. So one of the concepts, I think you mentioned that implicitly, is the idea of flow, right? So, and that's the concept worthwhile knowing. I can't pronounce it. I'll try it. Okay. Csikszentmihalyi, I don't know. So Mihaly, sorry. Is anyone able to pronounce the name? I think it's Hungarian, I believe. I struggle with it. Anyway, so look at the name, remember it, that's pretty good. But the concept is the key. So he came up with the idea of being in the flow, right? So in the zone, sorry, in the zone. Do you guys have this experience personally?
You're just so focused on the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So well, game is of course one, yeah. So you can share that, right? And then you forget about everything else, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Apart from breathing, okay. But you know, suddenly you get out of the flow and oh damn, I'm really hungry. I should have figured it out like 2 hours ago. Something like this. No? Yes, perhaps. Right. Or I haven't showered for 3 days. Nah, that's not the one. But a bit more sensible. But the idea is basically. You want to say something? Oh.
No, just that. Yeah, I've experienced.
So it's basically precisely this trade-off on the one hand of having individual skill levels, right? And the challenge level, right? And the idea is that the challenge level somehow in the game needs to correspond to the player's skill level. Right? That's the key thing. So it's about adaptiveness, or, I mean, there's multiple ways out of this. Of course, either you can have a choice of difficulty, the classical approach, easy, medium, hard, or something like this, right? So you kind of let the player decide where he thinks he sits, or she thinks she sits, with respect to the game. Usually means you get it wrong the first time and then adapt. And you get the feeling of the game, right? So make the AI harder or stupider and so on. Or that the game actually adjusts based on the observation it makes. Accuracy of, hitting targets, or, speed of lap. If you have a racing game or things like this, then the opponents are adjusted accordingly. And of course, on the other side, then the challenge level. That's the key thing. And the fundamental idea is there that you need to get the balance right. Ideally, you want to end up in this flow situation here, where you have a reasonably high challenge level, and you develop the player skill. You use the player skill to its best potential, right? So that's sometimes hard because, of course, as you say, for example, you don't have a particular liking for football games, if you like. So then it's like super hard to get you totally in the groove there, right? So you need to find something that, or a player needs to find something that meets those characteristics. But fundamentally, the theory is about finding the optimal balance there. So, of course, if there's no challenge and no skill involved, then you're indifferent about it, so apathic about any involvement. And if the skill level is too high relative to the challenge, then it's just relaxation, right? So you're just chilling out. That's possible as well. I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know. You can probably come up with an example of an activity that is just chilling out and doesn't afford much, challenge on your part, right? So. Then, of course, the anxiety thing, that's the classical exam situation. So where you think your skill level is incredibly low, you go into the exam and think the challenge is very high, and then it usually goes into this direction, hopefully, so more often than not here. But, that's where you basically don't want to have anyone be, right? So having this frustration situation that you feel, oh, I can't do it, it's way too much, I don't have background in this. Yes, so that's basically the idea. So then there are of course techniques to deal with this. One neat one is skipping easy sections, right? So if there's an intro section in a car racing game where you get the player comfortable with the car or whatever, then you probably just skip it, because if you really force a highly skilled player through that one, you kind of lost the highly skilled player, right? So not good. So there's the continuous adaptation, of course, the choice of difficulty, classic, and test it, right? Test it. Whatever, test it. Yeah, please.
Isn't there some games that sort of exploits the whole anxiety side of the? Could be I'm thinking more like something like, say, PUBG or something like that. If you understand know what I mean?
Not quite. Yeah, elaborate a bit more. Give the class a feel of what you mean.
So like, you don't feel like you're in control. That makes like
Yeah.
makes you anxious, right?
Yeah.
And if you still manages to like win.
Ah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Now I understand what you mean. Okay, right. That could be one scenario. But the point is, the challenge is there, or the risk there, more than not winning the game, is probably to keep the player, right? So engaged with this. Well, you know, not every player will play that game,
no.
right? So that's what I mean. So you may have stereotypes that fall into it. I think one of the anxiety thing is also about risk averseness.
I don't know, you could speculate the same
Okay.
same issue with like if you play like something like Diablo 3, right?
Yeah.
On hardcore mode.
Yeah.
Because like there's always
okay.
a risk of I don't know.
Yeah, but aren't you, I mean, yeah, of course, I understand what you mean, but if you play in hardcore mode, right, so Diablo 3, you're not
Yeah,
going
yes,
in there without having played that game before,
True, yeah.
right? So you have some sort of confidence, or you want to test your confidence, but perhaps you just want to figure out your skill level, actually, right? You just go in there, and most likely you kind of more in this one here, perhaps probably more aroused on being, yeah, I want to, you know, I want to make it, right? So you're kind of on the borders, of course. This is not hard and fast in theory, of course, but you know, it's probably not as critical as here, right? So this is really like, I guess more like burnout style stuff, right? So that is probably not necessarily. I mean, just as an anecdote, there were some students of us that got the balancing wrong. So they had an external reporter coming in. They made a horror game, and that was way too much apparently because it was in VR, right? So and then it was a bit too immersive, and that was in that category there. The person was totally unable to deal with this. It was very immersive, very real. So I mean, the challenge of interacting with it was too high. So I'm not sure if you ever touched VR afterwards. But anyway, so it's important to bear that in mind, right? So you had a comment.
I was thinking about horror game would be like anxiety, like you said.
Yeah. So it would be in this category, right? So, but it's also important to think about. Remember the skill level, right? What does skill mean in this particular game? You know, if you, for example, just sitting there need to survive it, that means that you relatively to the game have a reasonably high skill if you survive it. You know, what does skill mean, right? Is it that do I need to be fast to be accurate in targeting something? Do I need to be a good driver? So how does it correspond to the game? It's really hard to pin that down, I agree. But you need to shoot monsters, for example, right? So then there is a certain skill need. If you're just sitting there and you have some horror experiences, like in a movie, that is then, can be all across the scale, in fact, to some extent, right? Because it's usually very passive. Skill level is not particularly high involved. In fact, now usually it's more on the challenge level, it's reasonably low, so that's one. But horror is definitely in this category, you're right. So if you find it. Shall I give you guys a bit of a break? Because I'm talking a lot, no? Yes? Please, right? Yes, I knew it. 10 past, 6 minutes, because we don't want to spend the entire weekend here. Of course we can, but no.